Hi everyone, it's great to be with you today. My name's Ruth Redding and I'm a restorative practices consultant here in Melbourne. I have a number of years experience working with restorative practices both here and in the US. I'm a primary school teacher and have had a breadth of experience, not just working in my classroom, but how do we bring restorative practices right across the whole school community. And then I've also had the opportunity to work with a number of secondary schools and primary schools on how to best implement restorative practices into their schools. I also did similar things in the US, working in elementary, primary schools, junior highs and high schools, right across one of the counties in California. But one of my favorite things working in the US was working in the juvenile justice system. And I got the opportunity to use the restorative process with young offenders to help them take responsibility for their learning, to be able to repair the harm and to help them integrate back into their families, into their homes and into their communities. And it is such a privilege to be able to work with you today here at Marcellin College, to be able to help you work with your students for positive change. So, one of the things that you'll be familiar with is the continuum of restorative practices. And that continuum is similar whether we look at it in a pyramid shape, but I like to look at it as moving from one end to the other of a spectrum, so to speak. And you'll notice that we have the preventative measures, the things that build relationships, that prevent conflict and harm. And then on the other hand, we've got the responsive measures. How do we deal with things when conflict does happen? And most of the time today, we will be spending working with the responsive measures, with these measures here. And you'll notice that the restorative chat, which we're going to focus quite a bit on today, looks at both the effective statements and relational conversations and the restorative group or circle. We'll also dive into a couple of preventative measures, because we always need to make sure in our practices that we're using our preventative and responsive measures. That's when we're going to get the most effective results, so to speak, when dealing with student behaviour. I am sure that you are familiar with B.F. Skinner, one of the great behavioural psychologists, and he coined the phrase that behaviour is communication. And this is something that for me is really important when I am considering working with students, actually working with anyone. When someone is acting in a way that is not like them, whether they're being super euphoric, silly, whether they're recluding into themselves, whether they're acting out, they are trying to tell you something. And a lot of time our students, especially our students who have got trauma in their life or have had adults in their world who possibly haven't engaged with them in positive ways, they're not going to jump up and say, "Oh, excuse me, Mrs. Redding, I just want to let you know I've had a really disruptive morning. There was no food in their house. My dad said that I was a whatever, and I missed the bus on the way here. So things might not be so great." They're not going to do that. What we're going to see is a slumped behaviour or calling out some way that they try and make themselves feel better. So our job is to find out, what are they trying to tell us? And the only way, or the best way that we can do that, is to actually ask them. And that's why the restorative process is so great, because it asks the same questions over and over again that creates a safe place for students to be able to respond and to be able to trust you to help them. So we're going to look at a number of responsive tools. So these are the tools that we use when conflict has happened. And the main tool that we're going to be looking at today is the restorative chat. I am sure that you are familiar with the restorative chat as a basis for how to resolve conflict, because it's the basis of all restorative conversations. But one of the errors that I see in using it is that when conflict's occurring, if there's an argument, a disagreement, a fight, vandalism, when things are in the midst of occurring, we can't just jump in and say, "Oh, excuse me, what happened? Who's been affected? How are we going to fix it?" It doesn't work. The restorative chat, those actual questions, fit into a process. And this is the process. Working with our students for positive change, we want to go through a number of steps to help them resolve conflict. My goal when I'm working with students is to be able to step them through this process so that by the end of it, they feel good about themselves, because They have fixed the problem, they've repaired the relationship, and now they've got strategies for what they might do differently next time. And that for me is a win. I don't want to be a person in authority in their world that rescues them, fixes things for them, or is like a drill sergeant and tells them what to do all the time. I want to be someone who walks alongside them, coaches them, helps them experience what it's like to feel the weight of having had a problem, but also the relief of being able to fix it and to equip them for life. So when we look at the questions, what we're looking at is this part, this ask questions piece. And you'll notice that there's a couple of steps that we need to do before that. And the first one is to connect. Now, whether it is connecting with them at the beginning of the day, connecting with them preemptively to make sure that we're connecting. We all have students in our classes, in our schools, that we would say would bubble a lot. And they're the students that I'm constantly looking out for to make connection with. I'm going to use their name when I'm in the corridor. Hey, Jamie, how you going? I'm putting some money into this emotional bank account that we have. How was your weekend? How did Essendon go with the footy on the weekend? Not that we'll be doing that at the moment. I'm constantly finding ways to put money into this emotional bank account to make investments, because I know, particularly with these students, that there are times when I'm going to have to make a withdrawal. And it's a lot harder to make a withdrawal when there's not a lot in there than when there is. Sometimes working with students, I'm only going to be able to connect with them a moment before I've got to make a withdrawal. And so I've had incidences where I've been on yard duty and I've had to go and intervene in an incident, and I haven't known any of the students involved. It's normally when you're an emergency teacher and you get those great joys. And as I'm approaching them, I'll be asking other students, what are the names? What are the names of those students that are involved? So that straight away I can go in and say, Jeremy, and I'll smile at them and I'll look them in the eye. Their name says, I see you and I know you and you're important. A smile says, it's going to be okay. You're not in trouble. Let's try and sort this out. So it can be a little disconcerting, because I think a lot of students expect us to frown, but we don't want to do that. And then the most important is eye contact, because the eye contact says, I'm safe. I'm looking at you. I'm here to help. So they're the things that we want to do, as like either, it might be a day before, a week before, or a moment before we deal with an incident. Once we've connected with them, the next thing that we want to do is to show them loads of empathy. And no one says it better than one of my favourite leaders in shame and vulnerability, Brené Brown. And what she says is empathy doesn't require that we have the exact same experiences as the person sharing their story with us. Empathy is connecting with the emotion that someone's experiencing, not the event or the circumstance. And so when I am going into a situation, before I get to the chat, I've connected with them, and then I want them to know that what they're experiencing is okay. How they're reacting to it may not seem reasonable to me, but for them, it's really important. With some of our students, it might seem like the smallest thing where a student knocked something off their desk, but it caused this massive reaction because it's about the emotion, what they're experiencing, not the incident itself. And oftentimes there'll be a great history behind it of incidences and experiences that person's had that builds up. So I'm going to connect with the emotion, not the actual incident itself. My aim at this point is to understand and to let them know that what they're feeling is okay, not to fix it. I don't know if you are familiar a lot with the neurosciences of the brain, but our brain has a number of functions, as we know. And one of them is to protect us, and the other is to think and reason. And I like to use my hand as an example. I want you to imagine that our wrist is our brain stem, and our hand creates the cortex, what we call the cortex over the front. And you'll notice on that it looks somewhat similar to the diagram. Now, Our brainstem is what we call our fight or flight. That's our subcortical arousal system, if you want the official word. This is our fight or flight response. And recently we've added in another word there, fight, flight, or freeze. So when someone comes into a traumatic situation where they feel under threat, they immediately come into, their brainstem takes over everything. Their brainstem becomes the boss, and it's a little bit like a caveman response. It's like, do I run? Do I stay? And if I stay, am I frozen? Am I scared? Or am I going to fight? Our cortex is what we call the CEO, our prefrontal cortex. It does all our executive functions. Things like making decisions, having judgments, planning, our moral reasoning is in there, and our sense of self. And what happens when we are threatened, when we come into some kind of confrontation, we have what we call, we flip our lids, and our cortex flips off and all our reasoning goes out the window, and that's where our caveman brainstem takes over and goes, do I fight? Do I fight? Do I flight? Or do I freeze? And it's at this point that we can't be asking questions. What's happening? What's going on? Why did you do that? Our best thing, you walk into a situation, why are you guys fighting? It doesn't help because we're in fight or flight mode. And what my job is to help calm the brain down. We're going to try and put that lid back on so then we can do some reasoning, because it's only when we're being reasonable, when our cortex is back in place and able to function, that we can go through the restorative questions. Now, there are three main things that we do to be able to put our cortex back on. And interestingly, not only is this where we reason, it's only when this is functioning that we're able to learn. So you'll know that a lot of our students who have a lot of trauma in their world, they're constantly flipped. They're constantly in fight or flight mode. They're constantly feeling threatened. And so their ability to learn is greatly limited because their cortex isn't on. So, 3 things that we can do to reach the learning brain, to keep that lid on. The first one is to help our students regulate. So once they're in fight, once they've flipped their lid and they're in this fight or flight mode, what we want to do is be able to help them soothe and comfort them and reassure them. And that's where empathy comes in. I can see that you're really upset. This must be really tough. Yeah. This sucks. Some kind of phrase that helps calm them down and helps you have empathy. We don't want to use any sarcasm. Using sarcasm with any young person isn't helpful, but particularly in times of crisis, we don't want to do that. So what we want to do is offer soothing things. And with students who have a number of who have a lot of trauma in their world, you'll notice that we'll start to use a lot of self-soothing techniques, and there's a number of strategies that you can use to help students learn how to self-soothe. So once they've done that, we then want to connect with their emotions, and we're going to empathize with them so that they feel seen and heard and understood. And the thumb kind of is where the limbic system fits. So as soon as we show empathy, we're kind of killing 2 birds with the one stone. We're helping them comfort, we're helping them soothe, and then we're actually getting them to connect. And then once that's done, once they're calm and connected, then they're able to engage in learning. And discipline in the restorative process is learning. We want them to learn. How could they do things differently? How can they fix things? So heading straight for the reasoning brain doesn't work if someone's being dysregulated and disconnected. Another strategy for helping de-escalate is just some phrases that we can use, particularly when our students are really heightened. And so saying something like, please speak more slowly, I'd like to help, that's that soothing. When we talk more slowly, we actually start to soothe ourselves. What would you like me to do? That's the empathy piece. And then any question at all after that actually helps to put our cortex back in place. And it doesn't matter, can I get you a drink? Would you like to take a breather? Would you like to stand over here? This isn't the time to tell them what to do, because we're wanting to give them power and control back. The next step is then asking our questions. And this is where the restorative chat comes into place. So the restorative chat I have one that looks like this, and you might have one that looks similar. But it goes through a series of questions that both the mistake maker, the wrongdoer, and the person harmed, the victim, get to respond to. And what we want to make sure that we do is to go through each of those steps to make sure that we get to some kind of resolution and then some kind of accountability. Sometimes what I've found, particularly when I'm tight on time or when I haven't practiced the restorative chats a lot, is I'll rush through the first few questions. So I will rush through, these questions, and because I just want to get to these ones, the how are we going to fix things, how are we going to make things work. But what I find is if I rush to this part, I'm actually going to miss out on actually finding out what happens, and then the students end up telling you anyway. So one of the best ways to get to the bottom of the story, so to speak, and not that we want to delve too deeply into it, but is to keep asking, and what else? What I've found with a lot of young people is that they're very reserved in sharing what actually happened. It takes a lot to be vulnerable, particularly if you've been hurt by being vulnerable before. And so what I'll keep asking is, and what else? So, well, I graffitied the table. And what else? Well, I was really angry because, Mr. Bartholomew said that I needed to resubmit my piece of work, and that seemed really unfair. And what else? Well, I'd already told him that. So when we say, and what else, we actually start to get to the heart of the story. Or you might say, anything else? Anything else I'll use towards the end, because eventually they'll say, no, there's nothing else. The what else gives them permission to speak, and it helps them connect, and you end up sharing what actually is in the heart of what's going on. So those questions are really great when we look at particularly those first questions. The first questions of what happened and how does that sound and what were you thinking at the time is really important. What were you thinking at the time? I don't know. Well, if you did know, what would it have been? These are the kinds of questions that help probe and pull things out. And then, when we ask about what are we going to do to fix things and what else? Say sorry and what else? Sorry is great, but often there's more that's needed than that. So when we're looking at our restorative chats, we want to make sure that empathy is king, that we need to be engaged in the process as much as we're expecting our students to. And empathy says, you are important, this is important, and I can understand. As I said before, the students need to be ready to talk about what happened. There's no point in having a restorative conversation if someone's lid is still flipped or if they're not ready. And all the students who have been involved in the conflict need to agree that to be involved. We obviously conference the incident and not the person. It's not about a person's identity. It's not about their moral standing. It's about here's the problem and this is what we need to do to fix it. Everyone gets the chance to have a say, and students share how they can fix things. And then we need to make sure that there's some accountability and follow up to make sure that happens. One of the things that I'll often hear teachers say when they're doing a restorative process and it's not working is, it doesn't work. It's just a nice conversation, and then everyone, leaves and there's, nothing left to do. Well, what I will always say to that is that there are always consequences for wrongdoing, but the consequences are implemented calmly, logically, and fairly. And if there is a school rule or a school procedure or policy that's been broken, and there are certain steps involved with that, we'll always go through the restorative process. But after that, I'll say to the student, I just want to let you know, and as you know, align with the school rules. When you vandalise, when you hit someone else, there are some school steps that also need to take place. So I'm really proud of you for the way that you've gone through that process and fixed that, but we also need to include these. And so it's just showing them that we care about them, but telling them, yeah, this isn't fun, but this is the reality of what happens when you choose to do something that it goes against how we work here at our school. Sometimes I also find